Mr. Sartaj Aziz, the Chairman of the SPDC Board of Directors, to please give his concluding remarks. Thank you.
Posing a very serious threat to the Pakistan's not only economy, social fabric, but also its political system. In my view, this is one of the best SPDC report out of 10 reports that have so far presented, because it deals with some very, very we all, of course, read about different incidents of suicide bombings and bomb blasts from the newspaper, and then we go on. But there's hardly anybody who is unaffected psychologically. Deep down, we are all worried about the future of the country. Even if we are not directly affected, it is something which is in the air. And there is, whether we see kidnapping for ransoms, whether we see drone attacks, whether we see army operations, ultimately lead to a strange kind of political and social uncertainty, which is now affecting the entire structure of the society. What the report does, and also that as far as terrorism is concerned, we need aggregate numbers, 10 billion or 8 billion cost, but this report presents a very detailed analysis of the nature of that cost and how, although it's an Institute of Social Policy, it has also gone into much deeper analysis of the consequences of this in different provinces, and a very systematic analysis of the impact of this in social and economic terms. Similarly, the aggregate economic cost and social cost have also been analyzed, as you saw, in terms of how does it impact. Now, this integrated analysis has a bearing because it brings out the nexus and therefore deserves, as the question answer showed, further work on some of these, because if you want to address the underlying causes of terrorism, then you must also analyze the actual factors that are. So to that extent, it provides a rich field without being conclusive. How do we go? Here I might sort of answer the question about the war of ideas in Pakistan and how do we deal with the underlying issues. You see, some of you who have studied our history would recall that when the British conquered, so to say, India in 1857, and Muslims were on the decline after ruling the subcontinent for 700 years. Anytime in a civilization is on the decline, it looks for opportunities to reassert itself and look for its identity. So in the next 2-3 decades, 3 different Islamic movements started in India. One was the Aligarh movement, which wanted to deal with the dominant civilization in their own terms, do education, become more modern, more forward-looking, and so on and so forth. The second was the what you call Barelvi movement, which started with the reformation of Islam to become more tolerant and more modern. And the third was the Deobandi movement, which was more confrontational. The first 2 schools were accommodative, and the third school was confrontational, that here we are challenged, we must fight and we must get it. Now, the Pakistan movement in the 30s and 40s was built on the first 2, the Aligarh movement and the Barelvi movement. And because it was a broad-based, accommodative and tolerant, all factions of Muslims, no matter where they were, with very few exceptions, joined the Pakistan movement in a very massive movement and followed Iqbal's thoughts and Qaid-e-Azam's leadership to create Pakistan. And for the next few years, there was some kind of a debate in the country when the constitution was being formulated or elsewhere. But in the 70s, when the Afghan war started, the Deobandi faction of Islam started receiving what you call state patronage. And that is where the balance of forces, Islamic forces which created Pakistan, began to be upset in some way. Now the Afghan war also brought militancy into that, because only by training Mujahideen you could defeat a superpower. So here was a situation in which you, in the name of Islam, you trained hundreds of thousands of people to defeat the Russians. The 9/11 brought a totally different dimension and lent further violence that you can fight in the name of Islam. So now our own complication, starting with the Afghan war, was complicated by what I would call global fault lines. I think we would have been able to sort out our own problems in a way, because the majority of people would still belong to the more liberal or moderate kind of Islamic view. But the global fault lines, the Afghan war and then the 9/11, further complicated our task in dealing with the issue, and gave opportunity to these groups which now wanted not just defeat the Russians, but a piece of territory, first in Afghanistan and then in the tribal area of Pakistan, where they could rule and spread their own kind of Islam. And I think the whole concept of spreading Islam by force is not in line with the basic teaching of Islam. So I think we have so now we are facing a very major divide in the country based on these lines, and that divide does require a political consensus, and the only way we can deal with it, this war of ideas, is through a multiplicity of a democratic process. In other words, the only way you can deal with it, more participatory process, and then isolating those extremists who are wanting to use Islam, force for spreading Islam. So it is a very serious issue for us, because the choice is not between Islam and secularism. The choice is between extremist Islam and tolerant moderate Islam. So I think anybody who thinks that we can solve, and in the Western world generally they bracket all the Islamic forces and say, if you become secular, you will become all right. I think we have to go back to the original idea that we are talking about. So I think that is where we have to come back to our basic, and that is where the civilian strategy also comes in. If the democratic process joins it, then we have a civilian strategy to deal with this problem in a more fundamental way. So, as I mentioned, the report does talk of very serious social and economic consequences, and this shows that when people ask me very often, look, India is growing so well, even Bangladesh is doing better, what is wrong? The real problem is, and as I mentioned earlier, this is not just because of us, but the global fault lines are traveling to us and not only causing us direct costs, but a lot of indirect costs in terms of lost investment, lost opportunities, lost exports, and lost production.